Eleanor Wright pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Ferrari dealership, her frail hand trembling slightly as she entered the pristine showroom. The stark contrast between the world outside, where her worn shoes had shuffled over cracked sidewalks, and the gleaming, polished marble floor inside could not have been more jarring. She stood for a moment, absorbing the sight of the luxury vehicles around her, each one a testament to excess and affluence. Her attire was markedly out of place in this temple of opulence. Eleanor wore a faded floral dress, its hem slightly frayed from years of wear. A threadbare cardigan clung to her thin frame, the elbows patched in a manner that suggested more necessity than style. Her shoes, once black but now scuffed and worn to a dull grey, bore the marks of countless miles. A small, well-used leather handbag hung from her shoulder, the clasp tarnished and struggling to hold together the worn edges. She stood with a quiet dignity, despite the stark reality that she did not belong here, at least not by the standards of those who frequented such places. Across the room, Mr. Hayes, the manager, raised his head from behind his polished mahogany desk. His eyes narrowed as they fixed on Eleanor, a flicker of disdain quickly clouding his features. He was a man accustomed to assessing potential customers at a glance, and Eleanor's appearance immediately registered as not worth the time. "Who let her in?" he muttered to a nearby salesman, a young man named Greg, who was busy arranging brochures for the latest models. Greg glanced over at Eleanor and smirked. "Probably lost," he said under his breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. Eleanor's presence had not gone unnoticed by the other employees either. They exchanged knowing looks, subtle smirks playing on their lips as they observed her from a distance. One of them, a woman with sharply tailored clothes and a precise bob haircut, leaned over to her colleague. "Do you think she knows where she is? Poor thing must be confused," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Eleanor, despite the whispers, kept her focus. She approached the closest car, a bright red Ferrari Portofino, its sleek lines and polished chrome gleaming under the showroom lights. The car was stunning, an embodiment of speed and luxury, exactly the kind of vehicle James had always dreamed of. She ran her hand lightly along the smooth surface, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice cut through her moment of reflection. Eleanor looked up to find Greg standing a few feet away, his expression a blend of impatience and irritation. "Can I help you with something?" His words were polite enough, but the tone was unmistakably condescending. Eleanor met his gaze with a steady calmness, her blue eyes bright but tired, the wisdom of years reflecting back at him. "I'm interested in this car," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft, as though each word carried the weight of a long journey. "It's for my husband." Greg's eyebrows shot up and he exchanged a glance with another salesman who barely suppressed a chuckle. "Right, of course," Greg replied, his voice laced with disbelief. "But, you know, these cars, well, they're quite an investment. Maybe you'd be more comfortable with something else. We could arrange for you to see some, more affordable options." As he spoke, Greg's gaze drifted over Eleanor's attire, the judgment in his eyes thinly veiled. It was clear that he considered her out of her depth, like a fish on dry land, floundering in a world far beyond her reach. Mr. Hayes, who had been watching the interaction from across the room, decided it was time to intervene. He strode over, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. "Is there a problem here, Greg?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No, sir," Greg replied, stepping back slightly. "The lady here was just asking about the Portofino." Mr. Hayes turned his attention to Eleanor, his smile thin and insincere. Madam, I'm afraid these vehicles aren't for everyone. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of our partner dealerships. They specialize in pre-owned vehicles, much more practical. Eleanor's hand fell away from the car, but she did not flinch. She stood silently, absorbing the sting of their words. Her heart ached, not just from the slight, but from the memory of James, who had once dreamed of driving a car like this. This wasn't just about a purchase, it was about fulfilling a promise, a final gesture of love for the man she had shared her life with. As the whispers and sneers continued around her, Eleanor turned to leave. But as she did, her gaze fell on one of the younger salesmen, a man named Michael. Unlike the others, his expression was not one of contempt, but of curiosity, perhaps even concern. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Michael saw something that the others had missed, something genuine, something profound. Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before she walked out of the showroom, the glint of the Ferrari's chrome reflecting in her eyes as she stepped back into the world outside. Michael watched her go, a question forming in his mind, a seed of doubt about the assumptions they all had made. As the glass doors closed behind her, the showroom seemed just a little colder, the laughter a little too harsh, and Michael, unable to shake the image of the dignified old woman, felt a stirring of something he couldn't yet name. Michael couldn't shake the image of Eleanor as she left the dealership. The quiet determination in her eyes had stirred something deep within him, a sense of unease that wouldn't let go. After a moment's hesitation, he followed her out, stepping into the crisp air of the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent over San Francisco, casting long shadows across the city streets. He spotted Eleanor sitting on a bench in a small park nearby, the kind of place that offered a temporary refuge from the bustling world around it. He approached her with measured steps, feeling a strange mix of trepidation and urgency. As he neared, he could see the way she sat, her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Her hands rested on her lap, clutching that same canvas tote, now with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. "Mrs. Wright?" Michael's voice was soft, careful not to startle her. Eleanor looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes, quickly replaced by a polite smile. "Oh, hello again," she replied, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of weariness. Michael took a seat on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his gaze sincere, "for what happened back there, at the dealership. It wasn't right." Eleanor waved a hand, dismissing his concern. "You have nothing to apologize for, young man. It's not your fault." There was a pause and she glanced away, her eyes drifting to the children playing across the park. "People see what they want to see." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the distant laughter of children and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor turned back to him, her expression open, if a little guarded. "Of course. What made you come to our dealership today? Why a Ferrari?" His tone was gentle, free from the sales pitch that usually accompanied such questions. Eleanor hesitated, then sighed softly. "It's not for me," she began, her voice tinged with emotion. "It's for my husband, James. He's not well. Stage 4 cancer. And it's his dream, you see. He's always wanted a Ferrari, ever since we were young. But we never had the means. And now—" Her voice trailed off and she looked down at her hands as if they held the answers to all the questions that haunted her. Michael felt a pang of empathy. He didn't know what to say, but he knew he had to say something. "That's why you came in today," he said, more to himself than to her. Eleanor nodded. "I wanted to surprise him, to give him something that could bring him joy in these final days. But I've already sold almost everything we own for his treatments. I have some money left, but not enough. Not nearly enough." Michael swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. The story wasn't just touching, it was overwhelming. He glanced at Eleanor, who was trying so hard to hold herself together, and in that moment he made a decision. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice firm with newfound resolve, "let me help you, now, following me." Eleanor looked at him in confusion. When Michael and Eleanor re-entered the Ferrari dealership, the atmosphere shifted. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the polished floors, reflecting off the sleek surfaces of the cars on display. There was a murmur of surprise as the two walked through the glass doors. Eleanor, the elderly woman who had been dismissed just hours earlier, was back. But this time, she wasn't alone. Michael walked beside her with a quiet determination that seemed out of place in a setting designed for opulence and superficial charm. Mr. Hayes was the first to notice. He shot a glance at his colleagues, eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. "What is she doing back here?" he muttered under his breath, annoyance creeping into his voice. The other salesmen exchanged puzzled looks but said nothing, their eyes following the unlikely pair as they moved through the showroom. Michael led Eleanor directly to the red Ferrari 812 Superfast, the car she had fixated on earlier. Mr. Hayes approached them, his expression a mix of incredulity and impatience. "Back so soon, Mrs. Wright?" he asked, his tone condescending. He looked at Michael, a silent question hanging in the air. "You're aware, I assume, of the price tag on this vehicle?" Michael met his gaze with a steadiness that took Mr. Hayes by surprise. "I am," he replied, his voice firm, "and I'm here to make sure Mrs. Wright gets exactly what she came for." A flicker of confusion crossed Mr. Hayes's face before he composed himself. "And how, may I ask, do you intend to do that?" There was a hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, as though he expected Michael's resolve to crumble under pressure. Michael didn't flinch. "I'll cover the difference," he said simply. "I'll use my savings and take on a loan against my salary for the next year." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The other salesmen, who had been watching from a distance, exchanged startled glances. This was unheard of. No one in their right mind would commit to such a financial burden, least of all for a customer they had no personal stake in. Eleanor looked at Michael, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Michael." "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't do that. It's too much." But Michael shook his head, his expression resolute. "Yes, I can. And I will," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "James deserves this, and so do you." Mr. Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but the determination in Michael's eyes silenced him. For once he had nothing to say. The audacity of the young salesman's offer was shocking, even to a man as cynical as Hayes. "Very well," Mr. Hayes finally said, his voice strained. "If that's what you want to do." He gestured to one of the other salesmen. "Get the paperwork ready." As the transaction was set in motion, the dealership seemed to hum with a new energy, one that was foreign to its usual air of detached luxury. Michael stood by Eleanor's side as she signed the necessary documents, his presence a reassuring anchor in a world that had suddenly turned surreal for her. When it was done, Eleanor looked at the keys in her hand, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. She turned to Michael, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to," Michael replied softly. "Just take James for that drive." And so Eleanor did. She drove the Ferrari out of the dealership, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. The roar of the engine echoed through the quiet streets as she made her way back to Palo Alto, where James was waiting. When she pulled into the driveway, James was already outside, his frail body supported by a cane. His eyes widened as he saw the car, a sight he had only ever dreamed of. Eleanor stepped out and handed him the keys, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "James," she said, her voice breaking, "it's yours." They spent that evening driving through the city, the wind in their hair, the world outside a blur, as they shared one last adventure. The Ferrari was more than just a car. It was a symbol of a life lived together, of dreams fulfilled at the very end. That night, as James lay in bed, a smile still on his lips, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. And Eleanor, despite the crushing weight of grief, knew that she had given him the greatest gift of all, one last moment of pure, unbridled happiness. It had been only a few days since James passed away, but to Eleanor it felt like both a lifetime and an instant. The morning air in San Francisco was crisp, carrying the promise of a new day, but Eleanor's mind was still wrapped in the fog of recent grief. Even so, she knew there was one last thing she needed to do, something James would have wanted, something that had been weighing on her heart ever since she had driven the Ferrari home. The dealership looked just as it had when she first walked through its doors. Though this time, Eleanor was different. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a tailored navy dress, modest yet elegant, and a string of pearls that James had given her on their 40th wedding anniversary. Her gait was slow, but purposeful as she approached the entrance, the polished glass doors reflecting the sunlight. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The reaction from the staff was immediate. The air of condescension that had marked her previous visit was replaced with a stunned silence. Mr. Hayes, standing behind the front desk, nearly dropped the phone he was holding. He recognized her immediately. How could he not? But the woman before him now seemed worlds apart from the one he had dismissed just days earlier. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his voice tinged with genuine surprise, struggling to regain his composure. "We didn't expect to see you again so soon." Eleanor smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, her tone calm yet firm. There was no bitterness, no lingering resentment, just a quiet resolve. Michael, who had been in the middle of assisting another customer, caught sight of Eleanor and quickly excused himself. His heart skipped a beat as he approached her, not out of fear, but out of a deep respect that had only grown since the last time they met. "Mrs. Wright?" he said warmly. "It's good to see you again." "And you, Michael," she responded, her eyes softening as they met his. "Thank you for everything." There was a pause, one that Michael filled with a nod of understanding, but before he could say anything further, Mr. Hayes, still trying to make sense of the situation, interjected. "Is there something we can assist you with today, Mrs. Wright?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, her posture straight and dignified. "Actually, yes," she began, her voice steady. "I came to let you know that I've sold the last of my properties. I'm no longer in any financial difficulty." Mr. Hayes blinked, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You sold your properties?" he repeated, almost as if testing the words on his tongue. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "It was the right thing to do. James is gone now, and there's no need to hold on to them. I'm in a much better place financially." Michael watched as Eleanor spoke, noting the composure in her voice. There was a strength in her now, one that had been overshadowed by the weight of her grief before. It wasn't that the sadness had left her. No, it was still there, a quiet undercurrent. But she had found her footing again. "And that brings me to why I'm here," Eleanor continued, shifting her gaze to Michael. "I want you to have the Ferrari." Michael's eyes widened in shock. "Mrs. Wright, She held up a hand, gently cutting him off. "Please, Michael. It's what James would have wanted. He would be so happy knowing that the car is with someone who appreciates it, someone who gave so much to make it possible. You helped me when I needed it the most. Let me do this for you." Michael struggled to find the right words, his mind racing as he processed her offer. The Ferrari wasn't just a car. It was the fulfillment of a dream, the embodiment of a life shared between two people who had loved each other deeply. And now Eleanor was asking him to take it, to carry forward a piece of that dream. "Mrs. Wright, I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "This is too much. I didn't help you for any kind of reward." Eleanor's smile was gentle, filled with a warmth that seemed to chase away the shadows that lingered around them. "I know that, Michael. That's exactly why you deserve it." For a moment, Michael stood there, torn between his gratitude and the overwhelming sense that he was unworthy of such a gift. But as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he saw the sincerity there, the unwavering conviction that this was the right thing to do. And so he nodded, accepting her offer not as a prize, but as a responsibility, a way to honor the memory of James and the kindness that had brought them together. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'll take good care of it. I promise." Eleanor placed the keys in his hand, her fingers lingering for just a moment before pulling away. "I know you will, Michael," she said softly. "And that's all I could ever ask for." The late afternoon sun bathed the winding roads of San Francisco's outskirts in a warm, golden light. The Ferrari's engine purred softly as it glided down the deserted stretches of highway, cutting through the stillness like a sleek, crimson arrow. Behind the wheel, Michael focused on the road, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Beside him, Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, gazing out at the familiar landscape. They had taken to these drives regularly, tracing the routes James had once loved. It had started as Eleanor's suggestion. She wanted to share the roads that had brought James so much joy, the places where he had dreamed of driving a Ferrari one day. And so, with the keys she had gifted to Michael, they began their ritual, the hum of the engine becoming a backdrop to their growing friendship. "James used to love this stretch," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a wistful note. "We'd come here on weekends just to get away from the city. He always said the hills made him feel like he could breathe easier." Michael glanced over at her, noting the soft smile that touched her lips. "I can see why," he replied, his voice measured. "It's peaceful out here. Feels like the world's a little quieter." Eleanor nodded, her eyes distant. "He had a way of finding the quiet places," she said. "Even in the middle of a busy life, he always knew where to go when we needed to slow down." The words hung between them, a reminder of the man who had brought them together. In the weeks since Eleanor had returned to the dealership, their connection had deepened, shifting from a bond born out of gratitude to something more enduring. They talked about James often, but their conversations had also expanded, about life, about choices, about the things that mattered most. Michael had found himself changed by these talks. Eleanor's reflections on life, her calm wisdom, had seeped into his own way of thinking. Her lessons, subtle yet profound, had started to influence the way he approached his work at the dealership. Eleanor Michael began, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've said, about how James valued kindness, about how he believed in treating people with respect, no matter who they were." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes thoughtful. And I think I've been too focused on the wrong things at work," he admitted. "I used to see customers as just sales, numbers, but since we've been talking, I've realized that there's more to it than that. People deserve to be treated fairly, with genuine respect." Eleanor nodded slowly, a proud gleam in her eyes. "You're right, Michael. It's not just about the sale. It's about the connection you make with people, about seeing them for who they are, not just what they can buy." Back at the dealership, Michael had begun to apply these principles. He made a conscious effort to slow down, to really listen to customers rather than rush them through the process. He started encouraging his colleagues to do the same, fostering an environment where respect and empathy were prioritized over profit margins. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but gradually the atmosphere at the dealership began to shift. Mr. Hayes noticed the change, though it took him some time to fully embrace it. At first, he was skeptical of Michael's approach, worried that the focus on customer experience might hurt sales. But as the weeks passed, he saw the results: a more loyal customer base, better reviews, and, surprisingly, a steady increase in sales. One afternoon, after a particularly successful week, Mr. Hayes pulled Michael aside. "I have to admit, Michael, I wasn't sure about all this at first," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "But you've shown me something important. We were too caught up in the numbers, in the bottom line. You've reminded us that there's more to this business than just making money." Michael smiled, his gratitude genuine. "It wasn't just me, Mr. Hayes. I've had a lot of help along the way." As the dealership continued to evolve, the changes became more noticeable. The sales team started taking more time with each customer, ensuring that everyone who walked through the door felt valued. The shift wasn't just in their actions, but in their attitudes, a newfound respect that permeated every interaction. Eleanor, in her own quiet way, had helped to bring about this change. Through her friendship with Michael, she had passed on the values that had guided her and James through life, and those values were now becoming the foundation of the dealership's success. Michael found a neatly folded note on his desk one morning, written in Mr. Hayes's familiar cursive: "We'd like you to take on the role of manager. Your approach is what this place needs." There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, but for Michael, it was enough. It was an acknowledgement of the work he had poured his heart into, work that had gone far beyond the numbers on a sales chart. As he settled into his new role, Michael felt the weight of responsibility, but it was a weight he carried with pride. The dealership had always been a place of cold transactions, where luxury and status were sold with a polished smile and a practiced pitch. But Michael had a different vision, one shaped by the values he'd learned from Eleanor and the lessons life had quietly imparted. The first change he made was subtle but significant. He called a meeting with the staff, gathered them around in the break room where the sterile, businesslike atmosphere softened under the warm, yellow light. He spoke plainly, his voice calm but firm. "We're not just selling cars," he began, meeting the eyes of each person in the room. "We're building relationships. What we do here isn't just about the product. It's about how we make people feel when they walk through that door." And it wasn't long before the customers noticed. Word began to spread about the changes at the dealership. Clients who had once felt like mere transactions now spoke of their experiences in glowing terms. They appreciated the warmth, the genuine interest Michael and his team took in their needs. The showroom, once a space of quiet opulence, began to buzz with a different energy, one that was welcoming, almost familial. Under Michael's leadership, the dealership became more than just a place to buy high-end cars. It became a destination, a place people visited not just to browse, but to be treated with the kind of respect and dignity that had become rare in such a high-pressure environment. Sales numbers improved, but more importantly, the dealership's reputation soared. People knew that when they stepped through those glass doors, they were entering a place where they mattered. The team, too, began to thrive in this new atmosphere. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before, a collective pride in what they were building together. Michael made it clear that their success wasn't just about individual achievements, but about how they supported one another. He encouraged open communication, regularly checked in with each member, and was quick to acknowledge their contributions. In time, Michael became known not just as a manager, but as a leader who genuinely cared. He wasn't the type to bark orders or to micromanage. Instead, he inspired through his actions, through his consistency and his unwavering commitment to the values he preached. His approach was simple but profound. Treat everyone, customers and colleagues alike, with the same kindness and respect. The dealership's transformation was undeniable. People began to talk about it as a place where something special was happening. Local publications ran stories, not just about the cars, but about the culture that Michael had cultivated. And while the numbers told a story of success, it was the intangible qualities, the atmosphere of mutual respect, the genuine connections, that truly set the dealership apart. As he walked through the showroom one evening, long after the doors had closed for the day, Michael allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the polished cars, and, in that light, he saw the reflection of everything he had worked for, not just the success of the business, but the sense of purpose that now permeated every corner of the dealership. It wasn't just about the cars anymore. It was about the people, their stories, their dreams, their dignity. And as Michael stood there, he knew that this was just the beginning. The values he had brought into the dealership were no longer just his own. They had become the heartbeat of a place that was more than just a business. It was a community, built on kindness and respect, a place where everyone, no matter who they were, was treated like family. The Bay Area morning was cool and misty, a thin veil of fog drifting off the Pacific and curling through the streets of San Francisco. Eleanor Wright sat by the large window in her modest apartment, watching as the city slowly came to life. The coffee in her hands had long gone cold, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were far away, circling around a new idea that had taken root in her mind, something that had been growing since James's passing. In the weeks following his death, Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. The grief was still there, an ever-present weight in her chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. Instead, it had begun to transform into something else, a drive, a need to do something meaningful with the time she had left. She owed that much to James and to herself. Her decision to sell the last of her properties had freed her from financial constraints, but it had also left her with a sense of responsibility. The money wasn't something she wanted to hold on to. It was a means to an end, a tool to be used for good. And then there was Michael, whose kindness had sparked this new chapter in her life. His selflessness had shown her the power of compassion, and it was that very compassion she now felt compelled to share with others. Eleanor stood up, leaving the untouched coffee behind, and walked to her desk. The papers spread out across it were filled with notes and ideas, outlines of what she envisioned as a program that could change lives. She picked up a pen and began to write, the ink flowing smoothly across the page as she sketched out the final details of what would soon become the Eleanor Wright Foundation. The foundation would be a beacon for those who had been overlooked, a lifeline for the elderly in the Bay Area who had nowhere else to turn. Eleanor knew all too well the loneliness that could creep in with age, especially for those who had lost loved ones or who had fallen on hard times. Financial support was one thing, but Eleanor wanted to go further. She wanted to offer comprehensive care, medical assistance, counseling, and, most importantly, companionship. She imagined the smiles of the elderly she would help, the relief they would feel knowing someone cared. It wasn't just about providing material support, it was about restoring dignity, offering hope. As she wrote, Eleanor's heart swelled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Michael, his voice warm and familiar. "Mrs. Wright, how are you?" "I'm well, Michael," she replied, a smile in her voice. "In fact, I've been working on something that I think you might like to hear about." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Eleanor could almost picture the way Michael's brow furrowed in curiosity. "Oh? What's that?" "I've decided to start a foundation," she said, her voice steady, "for the elderly in our community, those who are alone, sick, or struggling. I want to use the money from selling my properties to fund it. It's something I've been thinking about for a while now." Michael was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a note of admiration in his voice. "That's incredible, Mrs. Wright. I think it's a wonderful idea. How can I help?" Eleanor's smile deepened. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll need help getting it off the ground, spreading the word, finding people who need our support, and maybe even securing additional funding. You've been such a help to me, Michael. I can't think of anyone better to help me with this." Michael's laughter was soft, but genuine. "I'd be honored. Just tell me what you need." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and Michael worked closely together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The Eleanor Wright Foundation quickly gained momentum, thanks in large part to Michael's connections in the community and his unwavering dedication. They hosted small events, speaking to anyone who would listen about the plight of the elderly in their area. Slowly but surely, donations began to pour in, not just money, but time and resources. Volunteers signed up to visit the elderly, to sit with them, listen to their stories, and provide companionship that so many had been lacking. It had been months since she had launched the foundation in James's memory, months filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless planning. Yet, despite the busyness, Eleanor always found time to connect personally with those her work was helping. To her, the foundation wasn't just an organization, it was an extension of the values she and James had lived by, a way to ensure that even in their absence, the principles of kindness and empathy would continue to thrive. As she stepped up to the podium, the room quieted, the murmurs of conversation fading into an expectant hush. Eleanor adjusted the microphone, her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. She had spoken at events like this before, but each time felt new, as if she were rediscovering her own voice through the stories she shared. "Thank you all for being here," Eleanor began, her voice clear and warm. "When I first started this journey, it was simply to honor the memory of my husband, James. He was a man who believed deeply in the power of kindness, in the idea that every small act of goodwill could ripple outwards, touching more lives than we might ever know." She paused, letting the words settle into the room, into the hearts of those listening. "James taught me that life isn't about what we own or the titles we carry. It's about how we treat the people we encounter along the way. It's about the choices we make when no one else is watching." The audience remained silent, many nodding in agreement, others with tears in their eyes. Eleanor's story had become well known in the community, how she had walked into a Ferrari dealership not for herself, but to fulfill her husband's dying wish. How, in doing so, she had sparked a chain of events that had transformed not only her own life, but also the lives of countless others. As I look out at all of you, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room, I see a community that has come together, not because of wealth or status, but because of a shared belief in something greater. The foundation we've built is proof that when we act with compassion, we create a force that is stronger than any hardship we might face. In the months since its inception, the foundation had grown beyond what Eleanor had ever imagined. What started as a simple idea to provide support to the elderly had expanded into a multifaceted organization offering everything from medical care to companionship, legal assistance, and financial aid. The community had embraced the Foundation's mission wholeheartedly, and Eleanor had become a symbol of hope and resilience. She was often invited to speak at events like this, where her story continued to inspire others. But Eleanor never saw herself as a leader, only as someone who was carrying forward the values she had learned from James. Her humility was part of what made her so beloved, and it was this genuine modesty that made her message resonate so deeply with those who heard it. Eleanor concluded her speech with a quiet, heartfelt plea. Let's continue to build this legacy together. Let's ensure that every person in our community knows they are not alone, that they are valued, and that their life has meaning, regardless of the challenges they face. This is how we can truly honor those we've lost, by making sure their love and their values live on through our actions. The room erupted in applause, the sound filling the space with a warmth that seemed to reach every corner. Eleanor stepped back from the podium, her heart full, knowing that what she had set in motion was far bigger than herself. As she made her way through the crowd after the event, many came up to thank her, to share their own stories of how the Foundation had touched their lives. Michael was among them, his face glowing with pride. You've done something incredible here, Eleanor, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. This community is better because of you. Eleanor shook her head gently, a soft smile on her lips. It's better because of all of us, Michael, because we chose to believe in something bigger than ourselves. The Foundation continued to grow, becoming a cornerstone of the community, a place where love, kindness, and compassion were not just words, but lived experiences. And through it all, Eleanor remained the guiding light, her legacy a testament to the power of human connection. In the years that followed, the story of Eleanor Wright and her Ferrari became something of a legend in the Bay Area, a reminder that one person, driven by love and compassion, could indeed change the world. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this heartfelt journey. I hope you found Michael's story as inspiring as I did. A true reminder that leadership isn't just about the numbers, but about the people we impact along the way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who could use a little positivity today, and of course, subscribe for more stories that resonate with heart and humanity. Let's keep building a community where kindness and respect lead the way. See you in the next one.